13th chapter. And I'll be reading verses 31 through 35. John 13, 31 through 35. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another."
This morning I want to talk about this verse in John 13:35, that by this all people will know that you're my disciples if you have love for one another. It really is the culmination of everything Jesus did, was to say outside people will notice and see my people because of how they love. And so love, ultimately, God wants to perfect it in us. He wants to make it whole and complete, so that how we treat each other, it's a little bit like a family. When you see a family that really loves one another and is close and really takes care of each other, don't you notice that? Isn't it kind of visible? Even if you don't hear all their conversations, even if you're not there with them all the time, you see a family that has that love for each other. You can notice it. It's visible. There are things that are done. And the same is true really for a spiritual family. That if we have really a true love for each other, it becomes noticeable. And that's what God and Jesus is asking of us. This, by the way, is the fourth theme verse for this year. The theme for this year has been being disciples of Jesus Christ. And the word disciple means to be a follower of, a student of. And I used a bunch of them this year. For each quarter, I kind of had a verse. It was kind of the theme for that quarter. And this is the theme for this quarter. You are my disciples if you have love for one another. And people will know it. And so I want to talk about that. There's just a couple of passages we're about it a lot. Not only in his gospel does the idea of love come up regularly in the last 6-7 chapters, but also 1 John talks about loving one another probably as much as any book in the Bible. We often think about 1 Corinthians 13 as that's love, but most of 1 John is about loving one another and about caring for one another. And so I wanted you to turn over to 1 John chapter 4, and I want to start in verse 7. He said, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God." There's a traditional story about the Apostle John. Now, I don't know if it's of its truthfulness or not. It's just a story that kind of came down through historical, writings, that the Gospel of John, or that John himself, when he was very old, that many of the disciples were asking him, tell us something more. Give us something more what we should do. What more can we do? And he said, there's no new commandment. You've got to love one another. Or that is the new commandment. But he said, you've got to love one another. And they were kind of, well, yeah, but what else? What else can you give me? You know, how often are we like that? People tell us something really significant. We're like, oh yeah, that's really great. But yeah, can you give me something else? And very often, we don't really grasp the significance of what that person is trying to get us to think about. And so when we think about this idea of loving each other, I don't know that we always grasp the importance of it, or the depth of it, or fully grasp what it means to love. And very often, Christians have a tough time sacrificing for other people. Now that kind of sounds funny because we have passages that command us to do that, right? But I've heard it over and over again from Christians in church that they're not going to put themselves out for the church, let alone some neighbor out there. That they're not going to let the church kind of cause them pain and harm. They're going to protect themselves from the church. It just really isn't the kind of love God is talking about. The kind that actually sacrifices itself. When Jesus sacrificed himself for his disciples, did they make it easy on him? Was it easy for him to sacrifice himself for all the Jews? Or for the Gentiles? The Roman soldiers who were, nailing him to the cross? Very often, we find that difficult. Because it really is difficult. It's harder than most of us have ever done. Now, sometimes, and maybe oftentimes, parents have sacrificed for their children. Occasionally, children sacrifice a little for their parents. But parents, that idea of sacrificing for our kids, I think that's a place to learn the concept. Sometimes we give even when they don't really honor or respect us for it. But we do the right thing anyway. That's the kind of sacrificial love that ultimately God is asking of us to do for one another. And even more than that, he's asking us to do it for people who don't even love us, and don't even love him. It's harder. So this commandment to love one another is harder to do than just hearing those words. And one of the reasons I believe that it's hard to do is because very often we don't really know love. We think we know what love is, and I think we do know a part of what love is, and I think we recognize it oftentimes, like in a family or when we see a mother and her child. But sometimes I've seen a mother who had such strong emotions for her child that she didn't actually love the child. Does that sound weird? Because sometimes our emotions we define as love. Sometimes, very common in the world, to define sex as love. Sometimes it's very common to define our warm, fuzzy feelings, attraction, excitement as love. Now, sometimes those things accompany love, but very often they don't. Because there are people who get attracted to others, are excited to see others, who actually don't even love those other people. And in fact, there are those who are attracted to others who even hate those other people. Because love and feelings are not the same thing. They're close. They should go together. They don't always go together. But we confuse them. And so here he says, John is saying, beloved, we have to love one another. Love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. In fact, he kind of is saying all through here, if you don't love, and you don't love one another, you don't really know God. You might think you know God. You might know some things God did for you. But to know something is to have an experience and a deep understanding of it. Because if you don't learn to love, you don't really know God. Because God is love. And so he says, anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. He said, this was the love of God demonstrated for us. That's what the word to be something manifested, it means to be shown to you. He showed us his love at the cross. He says, I'm going to let you kill me for your sake. And he says, so that we might fully understand it. He says in verse 10, and this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. I love that word, propitiation. Nobody ever uses that word in life. That word, by the way, comes from the Greek word that's translated into that English propitiation is the word for the mercy seat of God in the temple or in the tabernacle. When they built the Ark of the Covenant and they built a solid gold top for that box, that was the mercy seat of God. And upon that mercy seat, every year the high priest went in with the blood of the sacrifice and sprinkled it on it. What he's telling us is that God's mercy seat is of Jesus. It's Jesus' blood upon the mercy seat for our sin. And he says, beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. If that's how God is going to love us, which means he loved us even when we didn't really love him. Do you think even all of his disciples loved him? You know, in John, the Gospel of John, it says that Jesus loved them to the end. And you know, it says that about every apostle and disciple that was with him, including Judas. Does it say that about the apostles, that they loved him right up to the end? Did they sacrifice themselves for him? No. When the fear came, when the fear became too great that they might die because of him, what did they do? They ran. Because they didn't love him the way God loves us. He knew that. How often, I remember it, you know, it was kind of one of the first one of the aha moments I had years ago. Preacher was here and he had said, you know, it was a parenting kind of classes and lessons. And he said, you're going to love your children more than they love you. And you just need to get over that and understand that. They're never going to love you the way you love them. And I started thinking about myself. Do I love my parents the way they loved me? The same, am I going to sacrifice for them the way they've sacrificed for me? No. Never. I probably won't even get the opportunity. Very often, it is that the children never fully grasp it until often later. Which disciples did, and the apostles did. They did love Jesus later, didn't they? They gave their lives for him later. But when he gave his life, they weren't willing to give their lives. Not the way God wanted them to. Some of them were willing to fight, but they weren't willing to lay down and let others kill them. Very difficult thing for all of us to do. And so, he says, in verse 12, no one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. This is how we take that love that Jesus gave us and perfect it. And the word perfect in the Bible doesn't mean the way we use the word perfect. We often mean the perfect to be something without flaw, right? That's how we use the English word. Something that's perfect has no flaw. But the word perfect used in Scripture is translated from an Greek word that just doesn't mean that. It means something that's whole and complete, that's grown up, like an adult. Okay? An adult is perfect in the sense that they have now become whole and complete. He doesn't mean without flaw. And so he's just asking us to learn to love. When we learn to love in this sacrificial way that God did for us, that's when God's love begins to be perfected in us, be made whole in us. So he says, verse 13, by this we know that we abide in him and he in us, because he has given us of his Spirit. And we have seen and testified that the Father has sent his Son to be the Savior of the world. Whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him, and he in God. So we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love. Notice he repeats that. So we've come to know, when we say and we confess Jesus is the Son of God, I believe he is my Savior. What I'm saying is I know how much he loves me. And whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. He says in verse 17, by this is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment. Because as he is, so also are we in this world. So I can have confidence in the day of judgment because I understand the love God has for me. And he says, there's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. If I'm afraid to go and be and see God, then I haven't really had love perfected yet in me. It hasn't grown up to its wholeness, its fullness. Because what I'm afraid of, why would I be afraid of going before God? Except for punishment, except for his judgment in some negative way. But if I understand his love for me, and if I have grown in my love for him and others, then the fear fades away. Don't you actually see that? Now, that sounds really kind of ethereal almost. It's like, wow, that sounds really good. But let me give you an example of where I think you see it actually happen. Most of us are a little surprised when we read about the Apostle Peter, who was arrested by Herod, who wanted to kill him in the book of Acts. Now we know God would let his apostles be killed at that point because he had already killed James, and it had pleased the Jews so much that Herod's like, well, let me kill another apostle. Make the Jews happier with me. And he wanted to do that in part because Herod was a cruel, horrible human being. And he was the ruler of that area of Israel. And he wanted the Jews to like him. And they didn't, generally. And so he's like, hey, I can do something. They like me more. And so he killed James. He's like, oh, let's grab Peter. So Peter's in jail. And it's the story of the angel who came. God released him from jail. And the angel came to Peter, I guess put all the guards. He was guarded, in that room, wherever he was. because he was going to be executed. So there were 4 guards with him. And the angel kind of put them to sleep, removed the chains, gets Peter out. But what was Peter doing when the angel came? He was sleeping. He's supposed to be executed, I don't know, 10 hours from then? I remember, less than a day. I mean, he's just sleeping through the night, and then he's going to be executed. He's going to be nailed to a cross. If you knew, if like 10 o'clock tonight, that you knew 6 o'clock tomorrow morning you were going to be executed, nailed to a cross, how well do you think you would be sleeping at 10 o'clock tonight? Most of us wouldn't be sleeping very well, would we? And here's Peter, he's zonked. In fact, he's so zonked, the angel has to kind of like stir him. He's like, he's out, sleeping soundly, because he has no fear. He's not afraid. Why isn't he afraid? Years earlier, when Jesus was executed, he was afraid. And yet here he wasn't afraid. What changed? Has God's love for Peter changed? No. The only thing that had changed was Peter himself. Love had been perfected in Peter. He now was giving of himself and sacrificing himself for God and for others in a way that he wasn't doing when Jesus was executed. And so the love of God had grown and completed Peter, and it had pushed out all the fear of punishment. And so he says in verse 19, we love because he first loved us. You know, I was thinking about it. I didn't go do it. I considered it a couple of days ago to go look up the studies that were done years ago. I mean, talking about like Middle Ages. There were, and I won't remember all the details, but there was a king in France that wanted to understand some things about the raising of children. And so only really a king could do this kind of study. So they took a bunch of children away from parents, really early. And they just fed them and gave them no actual physical touch or care. And the children essentially died, even though they had plenty of food and care. And they showed no sign of empathy or love or care for other people. They themselves didn't learn anything about emotions, essentially, and didn't learn love, because no care, no interaction was shown to them. No touching, no holding, no cooing, no baby talk, and they didn't thrive. They didn't survive, in fact, for very long because of it. So that one of the things we learn from that gruesome thing that was done was that we learn by others' actions. We don't, come into the world and we're just like, without anybody's interaction with us, we're going to grow into this real loving, caring person. No, we're only going to do that when others have loved and cared for us. And very often, we're only going to love and care the way others have loved us, right? In fact, the old saying, in fact, a lot of us might even think we like to practice it. What was the second greatest commandment of the Old Testament? Remember, the first was to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. The second was like it, Jesus said, to love your neighbor as yourself. So in the law, he said, you've got to love others the way you want to be loved. As you want to be loved, but is your standard of love the same as everybody else's or mine? Or God's? And very often, people do that. That is kind of the way people love. Typically, people show the kind of care for others they expect in return. And so, in fact, I was reading something a while back There's one of the commandments given in the New Testament that is directly changed. To love your neighbor as yourself is not a commandment for us. It's a commandment we can learn a few things from, but it's not a commandment for us. And why is that? Well, let me just back up here a little bit in 1 John 3, 11 to 18, and then we're going to look at over in John 13 for a minute. He says, "For this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother." Why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. So he does something, it's not good. His brother does something, it's good. He's like, "Hey, you're making me look bad." How many siblings have kind of chastised their other sibling for making them look bad? How many people in school have gotten on the teacher's pet because the teacher's pet made them all look bad? Right? That's a human tendency. What Cain did is very human. We all have it in us. And he says, we don't want to do that. We want to get beyond that. "Do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. Know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or in talk, but in deed and in truth." Lots of people like to hear the words, "I love you." But the words, "I love you," followed by behavior that is not loving, are empty and hollow. So the words, "I love you," can encourage people and can help them to know and remind them that you love them, but only if your actions and the things that you do actually are loving. Otherwise, they're just empty words. Very often, in fact, people get attracted to one another when they're young, and they say, "I love you," and what they mean is, "I think you're hot." "I'm really attracted to you" is often what they mean. Because how often, to 18-year-olds say that and go, "Yeah, I'm willing for others to kill me right now for your sake. I'm willing to clean up your vomit. I'm willing to clean up after you. I'm willing to care for you and take care of you as long as it takes." That's not really what we mean when we're 18 years old and we're attracted to somebody else. Because we don't really know love. It's not real love yet, it's attraction. And they're not really the same thing. Hopefully they go together. And hopefully they mold together. But they kind of starts that way, but it needs to end somewhere else. Just like our own love for God. It needs to start with what He's done for us and end with, what can I do for you? So I want you to turn back. 13. And we'll end with these passages that kind of already been read for us. There's a couple of them here in 13 and 15. There's a whole section here. I mean, from John 13, for quite a few chapters, you can read about love over and over again. But in John 13, starting 31, and this is why I say that the Old Testament command to love your neighbor as yourself is not for you and me. Because it's the only time. This commandment essentially usurped that one. It superseded it. It said, no, that one's not good enough for Christians. What I need you to do is I need you to love your neighbor like I have loved you. Now, that's a different standard, isn't it? God's love for me is not the way I generally love others. My standard of love isn't God's standard of love. But God has said, I need you to love others the way I have loved you. Your standard of love needs to be mine, not yours. So, love your neighbor as yourself? No. You need to love your neighbor as God would love your neighbor. And how has He loved your neighbor? He gave His life for your neighbor and you. So He said, now notice in verse 31, I find this really kind of fascinating. I don't know if it means anything at all. I find it really interesting and fascinating, though. The very first words of verse 31 say, when He had gone out. Do you know who that is? Because when you read that by itself, you might think, well, Jesus went out of the room with the rest of it. It's not. It's when Judas had left. This new commandment wasn't told to them until Judas left. So He only gave it to the other 11 and then the other people that were there. He said, I'm giving you a new commandment. You've got to love one another as I have loved you. Now, go on to 15. We'll kind of end with this section, starting in verse 9. And in this section, Jesus is talking in the beginning about Himself being the true vine. The Old Testament, especially in the in the prophet Isaiah, he writes a lot about the vineyard and about Israel being the vine, and that God cares for and tends. And Jesus said, I'm really the vine. All of those passages about the real vine of Israel, that's Jesus. And He said, and here He comes in verse 9, it says, as the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in His love. And all He means is, very often we take this idea of keeping the commandments as, well, that's a real authoritarian view, keeping the commandments. It just means to do what He said. You do the things I've asked you to do. Because if you don't do the things I've asked you to do, you don't really love me. But if I ask you to do this stuff, and you do it, that's a sign of loving Him. And He said, that's what Jesus did, right? So when the Father asked Jesus, I want you to go, and I want you to let them kill you, to crucify you. He said, okay. When He was in the garden, and He was sweating like drops of blood were falling from Him, and He's asking the Father to let this cup pass from Him, He said, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Because Jesus loved God. And so He says, this is my commandment, verse 12, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends. We have a trouble, I think, with the word command. Because when you think of the word command, that doesn't sound like a friend, does it? But notice what He's saying here. If you do what I command, you're a friend. You're not a servant. We think of the word commands like you're my boss, I'm your servant. But that's not the way Jesus is using it. He's saying, because here's the truth of it is, we really are His servants. He really is the boss. He is the judge. But He's more than that. He wants to be our friend. He is our friend. He's done everything for us we would ever ask of a friend. And He's saying, if you really want to be my friend, you've got to do the things I ask of you. And He says, no longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, He may give it to you. These things I command you, so that you will love one another. That's the commandment. The new commandment. Love other people. love the people around you the way Jesus has loved you, not based on what they deserve or what you prefer, but based upon God's love for them and for you.